用声音
碰撞世界，
生动活泼。
嗨，大家好，我是赛德。节目开始之前，想先做一个友情提示和一个特别推荐。友情提示是，这一次我们的嘉宾是一位加拿大人，用英文接受采访，所以我们做了英文原版和中文配音两个版本。现在你听到的是英文原版，如果想要收听中文配音版，可以回到播放列表选择。一个特别推荐是，2周前我们的少年节目 Knock Knock 世界邀请了少年们跟我们一起开了7月的线下选题会，11位少年听友通过讨论和投票，最终选出了他们好奇也与我们每个人息息相关的选题，也就是全球变暖。这个选题本身其实也是来自少年听友们的投稿。2年前声东击西也做过极端天气相关的节目，极端天气频发，全球变暖是罪魁祸首吗？这期和少年们共创的节目已经上线，免费开放试听，欢迎前往 Knock Knock 世界一探究竟。
嗨，大家好，欢迎收听声东击西，我们一起用对话来发现更大的世界，我是徐涛。那今天我们这期节目是关于加拿大和美国的爱恨情仇。由头是这样子的，我们都知道，自从特朗普开启了他的第2任任期，美国曾经的盟友包括加拿大在内，其实都有一些转向，他们困惑、愤怒，或者是开始批评美国，或者是无可奈何等等。而伴随着这些的呢，是我们观察到可能很多国家内部的民族主义情绪也在高涨，所以我们一直想要近距离的去观察一下他们这些感受和思考是如何发生转变的。而前几天我们声东击西的监制可轩刚好是采访到了一位加拿大人。
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, hi Mark. 然后我们先大概是会给听众介绍一下你自己。
我叫马克，我住在加拿大温哥华，从我家到美国大概40公里，开车的话大概半个小时就可以到美国的边境了。我在温哥华是在我们的电影行业工作。
马克会说中文，因为他曾经在中国留学和生活，而且他也比较有全球化的视野。
我以前在中国生活了还有工作大概4年，在苏州还有在上海。开始是做老师，然后我也是留学，在上海交通大学就学了一点中文。我们和美国的关系或者的感受是对，就是很复杂。第一，我们跟他们是非常非常近，我们的文化、我们的语言、我们的经济，还有我们的政府。还有时候很多加拿大人会害怕，因为我们的国家是比美国小得多了，对不对？他们是一个非常大、非常非常强的一个国家，所以很多加拿大人会一直在想，他们会害怕，我们就是被他们怎么说，就是被他们 swallowed
那为了让他可以更加充分地表达自己的经历以及他想法的转变，可轩对他的采访最终是以英文来进行的。以下就是可轩采访到的马克，一位加拿大人在特朗普担任总统之后所观察到的加拿大人的变化。
嗨，大家好，我是声东击西的监制可轩。在和 Mark 的交谈中，他一上来就告诉我，加拿大人作为美国的邻居，对他们的情绪很复杂。
Growing up in Canada, you almost feel like you're part of American culture, right? Like you're always watching American sports, TV shows, movies, and of course we love like traveling to America as well. It's like very close and the culture is very similar. On the one hand, we admire them, we envy them, and we also emulate them in a lot of ways. But at the same time, we also kind of fear them, we're skeptical of them, and we want to draw a clear line between us and them. Yeah, Canada was actually invaded by America, and they actually burned Toronto down. At that time, it was called York. It was the capital of the British colony of Canada. This is actually, I will say that this incident is called in English, it's the War of 1812. So 1812 was the year that it took place. At this time, Canada was still a colony of Great Britain. So we were not an independent country yet. And in retaliation, the British actually sent troops to America, and they actually burned Washington, D.C. and they actually burned the White House down famously. So this is like a little known fact. And actually a lot of Americans do not even know this. But in Canada, this incident is always taught in our history books. It's very well known. I think this is probably because for nationalistic reasons, maybe past governments, they want to emphasize the time that, when we resisted becoming part of America by force, but also to show that even though we are friends now, they can still be a threat, basically.
Mark 提到的1812年正是美国刚建国没多久的年份，在美国看来，可能这场战争有其必要性。
But this is part of the reason why it happened is because America had just become a country. They had just won the War of Independence against Great Britain. And from their perspective, they were worried that Great Britain, which was, of course, a very powerful empire at that time, would try to basically reconquer America and reincorporate it back into the British Empire. And Canada was still part of the British Empire. So they were worried that Great Britain would use Canada to basically resubjugate the US and take away their independence. So even though they invaded Canada, they probably viewed it as a defensive war.
而与美国相比，加拿大的独立建国时间甚至都不是那么明晰。
That's actually an interesting question because it's not totally clear. So usually the year that people say is 1867. This was the year of Confederation. So all the different provinces that were independent were joined together into one, but they were still under the British Empire. So it really depends on your definition of independent. A lot of other people will say it wasn't actually until the 1930s and the Statute of Westminster, which was I think 1932, that Canada actually gained autonomy in international affairs and would actually make its own decisions. So like as an example of this, in World War I, when Great Britain joined the war against Germany, Canada automatically joined the war, even though it was in Europe and actually has nothing to do with us. And in World War II, we declared war on Nazi Germany a day later than Great Britain. Not because we were less willing to go to war, but more so because they wanted to show that now we are acting separately from Great Britain. I'd say this is one of the big differences between the US and Canada is our shared history with Great Britain. We sort of just slowly moved away from them, kind of like a child and their parents. Maybe they slowly gain more and more independence as they grow up, kind of like this. Whereas like the US got into a fight and left the house when they were 17. So a lot of people will say like Canada is kind of like a mixture between the US and Great Britain.
所以同样是从英联邦独立出来，同样是新大陆上的移民国家，在 Mark 看来，被看作为打引号的两兄弟的加拿大人和美国人，他们的区别究竟体现在哪里呢？
And in general, I would say, yeah, like Canadians we're more like British people compared to Americans. Americans are extremely friendly. They're kind of very loud. They can be kind of brash, whereas Canadians are maybe friendly and polite, but we are more reserved. Canadians, for example, if you get into an elevator in Canada, people will usually just smile and nod at you. In America, a lot of times people will actually start talking to you. For instance, your audience might find this funny, but as a Canadian, I think American and Chinese people are actually very similar in some ways. Both Americans and Chinese people are like extremely, 热情. Like they're very outgoing and they will like always talk to you. It's actually something I love about living in China. And it's also something I quite like about America.
除了热情，美国人还有一个让 Mark 印象深刻特质，就是爱国。
I have a really vivid memory of the first time I went to New York City when I was around 9 with my parents. And one thing I remember is there are so many American flags everywhere. Like flags all the time. Walking down the street, you always see huge American flags. And you never see that in Canada. Maybe you see it in front of a few buildings or like government buildings, but you don't see that many. So I think this is one difference, is that they're much more overtly patriotic. Canadians, I think, are a bit more, I don't want to say humble, but we're a bit more circumspect in terms of our relationship with our country. We're not like showing off our flag and how great we are and so on. And I remember my dad said, oh yeah, Americans, they're a lot different from us. They're so patriotic. And at that time, he thought this was a positive thing. And he actually thought that Canada should be a little bit more like America, more patriotic.
Mark 的父亲是一位出生在上世纪60、70年代的加拿大人。
They grew up at the time when America was like by far the most powerful country in the world. 1950s through 1980s, let's say, the height of the Cold War. right? So like Canada was very tied to America in terms of our security and our politics as well. So his view was just that America is the best country in the world. It's the, you know, the birthplace of freedom and democracy and human rights and all these kind of things, right? So he will view it as, at that time, as like the best place ever. And he wanted to move there actually. But after he met my mom, she convinced him not to. She did not want to move there. And actually now he's very glad that they never moved there, because now he will say, he doesn't even want to visit there anymore.
而造成这种改变的原因就是
We will make
特朗普。
America great again.
It didn't happen all of a sudden, but I will say it also started a little bit during the first Trump term, because he really doesn't like Trump. So like during the first Trump term, he was also already thinking like, wow, like I can't believe Americans will really elect a guy like this. Like we all kind of realized that, oh, American politics in America is like a little bit crazy. At that time, Trudeau was our prime minister. Trump really did not like Trudeau, and he made a lot of like rude comments about him and stuff like that. And it was interesting because Trudeau, partially, you could argue that he was elected like just before Trump was. And a lot of people would argue that like part of his success was actually because of Trump, because a lot of people contrasted them. So a lot of people will say, oh, Trudeau, he's so young, he's so handsome, he's so charming, compared to Trump, who's like very boorish, very rude. He has a very, well-publicized history of making misogynistic comments and possibly even like sexual assaults and shady business dealings. He seems like a very kind of greasy, slimy guy. And Trudeau seems very clean cut. And a lot of people compared him to Obama. They say he is like Canadian Obama. So whereas people in Canada were very disgusted by Trump during the first term, they could look at our own leader in Trudeau, and who was at that time still very popular, and say, okay, well, America might have elected this guy, but we elected this guy. So we're kind of a lot better. But of course, after that, Biden got elected. So a lot of people kind of thought, okay, well, America was just crazy for a little bit, but now they're back to normal. But after the second Trump election, people kind of realized, okay, no, they're not back to normal. This is just who they are. And this is just what their politics is like now. Obviously, for Canada, it would have been better to have a Democratic administration under Harris. I think most Canadians were like pretty depressed about it. The exception would be people who were supporters of the Conservative Party. When he just won, like in November, a lot of the people who supported the right wing of Canadian politics, who supported this Pierre Poilievre, leader of the Federal Conservative Party, viewed this very positively.
这位右翼政党的领导人 Pierre 也被加拿大人称作
Maple MAGA. So like a Canadian version of MAGA, or like a Canadian version of Trump. A lot of people noted that he was quite similar, maybe not in terms of his policy, but in terms of his style and his rhetoric to Trump. He actually said a lot of times last year, he was saying, make Canada great again. He was like explicitly copying Trump's slogans. They thought, okay, if Trump can win in the States, we can win in Canada. You know, the Canadians were kind of like following America. People here will also elect Poilievre, who is sort of similar to Trump, right?
Everything is broken.
Everything is broken.
Political correctness.
Woke political correctness.
Defeating the radical left.
The radical left.
Because I have common sense, okay? And unfortunately, a lot of people don't.
They have no common sense. I am not.
But of course, that all changed once Trump started talking about actually annexing Canada. He started calling Justin Trudeau the governor of Canada, which implying that we are a state and not a country. This like changed that dramatically.
As I called him Governor Trudeau, I said,
I have to be honest, as a state, it works great.
At first, I didn't really think anything of it, to be honest, because Trump says a lot of things. He's always talking about this, blah, 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 right? Most of it is BS. He also said like, he will end the war in Ukraine on the first day in office. And he made a lot of promises that we know it's like impossible for him to actually achieve. So I think most people didn't take it that seriously at first. And we thought it's kind of just like a joke, or maybe it's like a bargaining tactic. We know that he was going to target Canada in terms of tariffs and to try to negotiate a new trade deal. But he kept saying it over like weeks and weeks. He like kept bringing it up over and over again. And eventually even people in the Canadian government and senior advisors and people in the media started to say, okay, actually, we have to take it seriously. So even after Trump got elected, people will still think, well, I don't really like Trump, but I will still maybe travel to the US or still go there to do business, or I will still buy American goods because that's what I always do. It was really because of the 51st state stuff. This is when I would say the trend towards boycotting American goods and also boycotting travel to America started among Canadians.
参与到这场抵制美国运动的加拿大人中，就有我们前面曾经提到过的，在年轻时非常热爱美国的 Mark 的父亲。
Because he really doesn't like Trump, but definitely this was like the straw that broke the camel's back. For example, my parents, they're what's called snowbirds. So in other words, this describes people who live in usually the state, Canada or northern part of the U.S. and who will travel to southern part of the U.S., usually like Florida or California, every year during the winter months when it's very cold back home. A lot of Canadians do this. They actually own a house in like Florida or California or Arizona. And my parents actually did this for maybe 8 or 9 years because they were retired. But after Trump started talking about this, they said, okay, we're not going back again. They said, okay, from now on, we will find somewhere else, go to like Portugal or something like that during the winter. And a lot of Canadians started doing this who owns houses in the US. A lot of them actually sold their properties and just said, I'm not going back anymore.
除了不再去美国度假， Mark 的父母也选择不再购买来自美国的商品。
I was talking to them the other week and they were saying how they basically will not buy any produce from America right now. They'll only buy from either Canada, Mexico, or somewhere else, but not from the States. So I would say that this is like a trend that exists before because it has a lower carbon footprint. And also it's good to support the local economy, but it's just been amplified or increased by Trump.
随着像 Mark 父母这样的加拿大人变得越来越多，超市也开始给本地生产的商品贴上类似加拿大制造的标签。
Or not so much that the grocery store is encouraging it, but a lot of people want that. So it became a popular trend. So a lot of grocery stores were kind of responding to consumer demand by highlighting which products are from Canada. There's even some controversy about this, like this concept of maple washing. So basically, like there are some products that are not really from Canada, but people are trying to cash in on this trend. And so they're saying, oh yeah, it's like produced in Canada, but maybe just one ingredient is Canadian and the rest is from somewhere else.
但实际上，这种只买本地产品的选择不是很现实。比方说水果和蔬菜。
We do grow a lot of food here, but in terms of like fresh fruits and vegetables, we can only grow them for like a few months when it's warm enough to grow them, usually during the summer. But let's say in December, probably nothing is grown. If you go to a Canadian grocery store, like a lot of the fruits and vegetables are coming from like Florida or California. The companies that are running the farms are much, much bigger than what you have in Canada. So they can produce it at a lower cost as a result. A lot of times American produce is cheaper and is the cheapest option than the Canadian one. I would say like on average, let's say 10 to 30 or 40% cheaper. There are usually other options, like you can buy something from South Africa or Chile or somewhere else, but usually it's going to be more expensive. And even if you buy something that is made in Canada, probably it has some things that are from the US in it. So like, for example, even if you want to make a t-shirt or some clothes in Canada, we don't grow cotton in Canada because we don't have the climate for it. So this cotton to make the clothes probably has to come from the US.
对 Mark 来说，还有另一个原因让他很难做到完全放弃来自美国的商品。
There are like a couple of things maybe that I will still buy the American one just because I really, really like it. For example, there's like one kind of apple called Cosmic Crisp that's only grown in Washington State, just across the border. This is like my favorite kind of apple, and this one I can't give up. At least this is what I tell myself, so I feel less guilty, is that Washington State did not support Trump, right? They actually voted for Kamala, so I will feel like, well, it's not like they didn't want Trump to get elected either, so I will feel bad to boycott all their apples.
而除了前面提到的产地标签， Mark 还在超市里看到了另一种新标签。
The other thing that you're seeing in grocery stores now is an identification of goods where the price has been impacted by tariffs. They have a little sticker next to the price of the product, and some of them, it will say T for tariff to tell you that the price is higher than it would be otherwise because of tariffs.
这当然是因为在口无遮拦地说加拿大应该成为美国的第51个州之后，特朗普又开始宣布要对包括加拿大在内的多个国家加征关税。
The Trump administration will impose sweeping new tariffs on the majority of U.S. trading partners.
Increasing tariffs on Canadian goods from 25% to 35% to take effect.
而根据 Mark 的说法，在特朗普的第一任期之前，加拿大和美国其实处在一种近乎是自由贸易的状态。
So before Trump's first term, there was basically very few tariffs. There was always some tariffs, but in general, it was like, as I said, more or less free trade between Canada and the U.S.
这是因为当时加拿大、美国和墨西哥之间有一份北美自由贸易协定。
This is the North American Free Trade Agreement. So this is a treaty that was between Canada, U.S., and Mexico since the early 1990s. And basically kind of like EU, not to the same degree, but establishes like free trade between Canada, U.S., and Mexico. So this is super important to the economies, and it's kind of because it's already been existed for like 30 years, it helped to integrate the natural resource and manufacturing economies of these three countries. It had some bad side effects as well, but overall, people would say that it was good for all three countries and like led to a lot of economic growth.
但是在第一任期内，特朗普就对这个协议非常不满。
He basically said, well, this is like a bad idea. We as in America are getting ripped off. But eventually they did reach a deal, which is kind of, I would say, the irony. They made another deal to replace NAFTA, which is still currently in place, which is part of the reason why they view him as so untrustworthy. Because even though he's actually now saying that America and Canada have a bad deal, we are ripping them off on trade. We are kind of like stealing from them. But actually the terms of the trade were negotiated by him in his first term. But he negotiated the deal. So people view this as kind of crazy, but also they view him as going back on his word. So it's like, what good is the agreement that we signed if you will just go back on it a couple of years later? It's like a contract, right? You can't just violate it like that.
但在过去的几十年间，就是因为关税几乎为零，很多产业链已经跨越国境建立了起来。
For example, like an American car, it will say made in America, but actually maybe it's manufactured. The final stages of the manufacturing take place in America. But most of those parts, a lot of them actually would be shipped to Canada. They will do some work on them, and then they ship back to the States. Some other thing happens to them, and then ship back to Canada. Oftentimes, like certain goods, parts of the car will cross the border like a dozen times, maybe 10, 12, 20 times, and also between US and Mexico before they will become one car. So the amount of specialization and integration between our economies is like extremely, extremely high. So it's really hard to like overstate that.
We don't really want Canada to make cars for us, to put it bluntly. We want to make our own cars.
而特朗普对协议感到不满的原因，依然是美国对加拿大的贸易逆差。
The U.S. has a trade deficit with Canada. So in that sense, it's kind of similar to the relationship with China. He says, well, we buy way more things from China than China buys from us. And this is bad in Trump's view. So he also targets Canada for similar reasons. I would say the difference is with Canada, it's almost entirely due to oil. So they are actually buying a lot of their oil from Canada. A lot of electricity that they're using in the northern states is actually coming from Canada as well. Obviously, we're buying a lot of cultural products and manufactured goods, fruits, things like that are all coming from the States. So if you take away oil exports to the U.S., we actually have a trade deficit with the U.S.
某种程度上，这让加拿大最大的原油产地 Alberta 埃伯塔省愿意和美国和特朗普走得更近一些。
Oil is their most important export, and it's like really key to the Alberta's economy. So of course, like the U.S. is their major market. Most of the oil that they get from Alberta goes to the U.S. to be refined. So their relationship with the U.S. is super, super important. And actually right now in Alberta, one of the biggest topics right now is actually an independence referendum. There are some people in Alberta who actually want to separate from Canada and become their own country. And a lot of this is because they don't like that the rest of Canada has become more antagonistic to America. And they think that, well, we shouldn't be so antagonistic to America. We should become closer to them. And maybe even some of them maybe even want to join America. It's not very realistic, even in Alberta. It's only a small minority. Maybe like 20, 30% of people there will support it. But it is more popular than it has been in the past.
但在加拿大的其他地区，那种爱国主义和只买国货的情绪就更加高涨。
There's definitely been like a boom and a huge demand for Canadian products. There's been a lot of news stories about local producers like struggling to keep up with demand. They were doing okay before, and all of a sudden now they have like a huge flood of orders come in that they actually can't fully fulfill. This is definitely a big trend right now. I guess I'm skeptical of whether or not this trend will last, but I think to a certain extent that it seems like people's opinion has been irrevocably or permanently changed about the US here. It's even had like a lot of knock-on effects. It caused the Canadian dollar to actually go down quite a bit because of this. The overall economic outlook is worse, but ironically, if the Canadian dollar is lower, that actually makes our exports better. So ironically, by Trump attacking us, he actually made a lot of Canadian goods more appealing to Americans.
Mark 所在的电影行业也是类似的情况。
Most films that are made in Canada are actually US films because it's cheaper to film here. So when Trump was first talking about that, there were a few productions that got scared away and actually relocated to the US, but most of them actually have stayed, and there's actually a lot of big new shows and movies that are going to be filmed here coming up.
除此之外，对于加拿大的公务员，特朗普第二任期的对外政策居然莫名其妙地导致了他们中的一些人被裁员。
Because Trump has basically asked all the other members of NATO to spend more on defense. For a long time, we hadn't very much money on our military, and we're actually spending less than we're supposed to spend. But now Trump is saying he's kind of forcing other countries to spend more. So our prime minister actually said that he's committed to basically meeting this 2% of GDP defense budget. So obviously this money has to come from somewhere, right? And he's going to cut a lot of the federal workforce in order to pay for the increase in the military.
现在正在裁员的这位新总理也叫 Mark， 全名是 Mark Carney。他在今年4月末接替特鲁多成为加拿大总理。但在很长一段时间内，大家预测会当选的人并不是他，而是我们前面提到过的那位加拿大版特朗普皮埃尔。而所有这一切的戏剧性，按照 Mark 的说法，也和特朗普有关。
And last year, most people assumed he was way ahead of our previous prime minister, Justin Trudeau. He was extremely unpopular at the end of his term, and for a variety of reasons. So Pierre Poilievre was widely expected to take over and to win the election this year, partially because of he was quite similar, maybe not in terms of his policy, but in terms of his style and his rhetoric to Trump. But this backfired against him after Trump took over and started issuing threats against Canada and threatening annexation. All of a sudden, his association with Trump went from something that certain people liked to a massive liability. So he went from last year being the clear favorite to win the election to badly losing the election this year and actually losing his own seat, which was like a huge embarrassment for him and, yeah, like a catastrophe for his party, the Conservative Party. They tried to change their rhetoric as well and say, oh, actually, we love Canada too, and we don't want to be part of the US, and so on and so forth. It obviously didn't work because they lost the election. Prime Minister Mark Carney, who then won the election a couple months ago, obviously like really took advantage of everything that Trump was doing and kind of used it to help them win the election by emphasizing that they will defend Canada against the US and that they won't let the US annex Canada and they will stand up for Canadian independence. There is actually another party in Canadian politics called the NDP, which is a more left-wing party. And they actually have quite a few supporters, but most of their supporters didn't vote for them this election. They actually voted for the Liberal Party because they think we all need to support. The Liberals are the biggest party. They say that they will support Canadian independence. We don't like all of their policies, but right now we need to focus on preserving the country. So a lot of people from the left wing, they all voted for them.
所以现在加拿大人对美国政府的印象是
About the US government, I mean, most Canadian people would have a very negative impression or idea of it, I would say. During the first Trump term, people will say, well, we don't like Trump, but most people in the US government, you know, they're still like working for the best interests of most people in the US at least. Whereas now, obviously, because Trump has pretty much replaced the whole government with like loyalists, people who are very close to him and who are like only loyal to him and only like follow what he says. But I think most Canadians will not like view individual Americans negatively, but I think that will also depend on their political persuasion. So like if they find out that that person voted for Trump, maybe they will have a different opinion of them. But I think overall, Canadians will still view Americans in a pretty friendly way, on an individual level.
当下在加拿大的社交媒体上流行的内容，或许也可以印证这种人命之间的关系。
This kind of story is very popular within the Canadian media and on social media in Canada. Some like street interviews or stories about Americans being like very, apologetic or feeling very embarrassed about, the behavior of their government towards Canadians.
主动示好的，甚至还有一些美国的州政府。
Like, for instance, I saw one story, it's a true story, about how the government of California actually launched an ad campaign in Canada to attract more Canadian people to come travel to California, because there's been a huge decrease in Canadian tourists coming to California. So as a result, like their travel and tourism sector is suffering. So they're basically saying like, oh, we still like you and we hope that you come back. And a lot of American not the American federal government that rely a lot on Canadian tourism have done the same thing. Also, I think Wisconsin and even Rhode Island or Michigan, some other states kind of close to the Canada border, have done something similar.
但即使没有对美国的抵制情绪，加拿大人也可能会对美国心生疑虑，因为边境的检查在这段时间也变得比以往更加严格。
So, for example, even there was some story about a guy who, when he was trying to enter the U.S., this is a Canadian guy, and they asked him, oh, what do you think of Trump? And he said, I don't like him that much. And so that guy actually got detained by them for 6 hours. And they interrogate him and question him. And finally they let him go. Most likely, if I went there, I think 99% chance nothing will happen. But I will still be a little bit nervous about it because of some of these stories. Also, right now, because the Canadian dollar is quite weak, it's actually very expensive for travel to America. But also, I also don't really feel like spending my money there. I had a trip with my friends planned to go to Portland, Oregon. We were going to drive there to see an NBA game. And because of what happened, we just said we don't want to go. We don't want to spend our money there. So we canceled the trip, even though we already bought tickets and booked hotel rooms. It's not universal. A lot of people still travel there, but I think most people are either traveling less or maybe only traveling if they have to.
尽管如此，大多数加拿大人依然认为和美国保持友好关系是一件很重要的事情。
So I think most Canadians would still recognize that it's better for everyone to have a good relationship with the U.S. Canada and the U.S. we're still neighbors, right? We share the largest demilitarized border in the world.
但 Mark 也认为，两国未来的关系在很大程度上取决于今后美国政治的发展走向。
Let's say if Trump continues to hold in power and the Republicans win the midterm elections, and maybe even if it's not Trump, but someone who's similar to Trump, were to win the 2028 election, then I think you'll have a big divergence between Canada and the US, and Canada will probably look to become closer to other countries and try to kind of diversify its relationships away from the US in terms of not just trade, but also politics and defense as well. Canadians did not choose to vote for Trump and did not choose to have this rupture in the relationship. If it was up to Canadians, we would like to continue on having a good and close and free trading relationship with the Americans. It was them that decided to vote for Trump, who in turn decided to blow up this relationship, right? And I mean, of course, it's also questionable whether or not most Americans actually wanted this. Even now, you're hearing that a lot of Americans who voted for Trump actually didn't expect him to do the things that he's doing and actually don't agree with a lot of his policies, right? So I think most Canadians will want to have a better relationship with the US. But if we have to, then we will look elsewhere.
那这就是今天的这期节目了，感谢 Mark 的讲述，也感谢听友吉吉三皮在本期节目制作过程中提供的帮助。欢迎大家在评论区留言讨论，如果你有想要和节目组分享的故事和思考，也可以在 show notes 中找到我们的投稿链接和邮箱。我们下期节目再见。